I want you to picture a Saturday morning in October. The kind where the light comes in sideways through the kitchen window and lands on the counter in a long warm stripe. Where the coffee is already made because someone got up before you and started it without being asked, and the kids are still asleep, and the dog is curled at the foot of the stairs, and for about 4 or 5 minutes, the world is completely quiet and completely right. That was my Saturday morning. Every week, for 11 years, that was what I had. My name is Diane. I am 43 years old. I live in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, in a house with a kitchen window that faces east, and for a very long time I genuinely believed I had built something solid. Something that would hold. A marriage that worked because we made it work. A family that was intact not by accident but by choice, two people who had decided, over and over again, to keep showing up for the thing they had built. His name was Marcus. We met when I was 26 and he was 29. He was finishing his MBA at Ohio State. I was 2 years into a mid-level marketing role at a healthcare company downtown. We were set up by mutual friends at a dinner party I almost didn't attend. I'd had a long week. I was tired. I sat in my apartment at 6:30 on a Friday evening in October, seriously considering texting a cancellation and ordering takeout instead. I texted my friend Jamie instead, who told me to stop being boring and get dressed. I got dressed. He was at the end of the table telling a story about a solo road trip he'd taken through northern New Mexico the previous summer, 3 weeks, no fixed itinerary, just a car and a general direction and whatever happened. Something about a wrong turn that led him to a town that wasn't on any map he had, and the diner there, and the woman who ran it, and the pie. He told it well. He was specific in the way good storytellers are specific. He didn't say the pie was good, he said it was the kind of pie that made you not want to talk for a few minutes, and everyone at the table laughed. I remember thinking he was the kind of person who actually had experiences. Not just a life, but experiences. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged in the fall of what would have been our 3rd year together, at a state park in southern Ohio where we'd gone for a long weekend. We got married the following June in a venue on the outskirts of town, about 140 people, a band that played too loud and we didn't care. We bought a house the year after that. We had Noah, our son, who is now 11. We had Lily, our daughter, who was 9. Marcus built a financial consulting firm. A real one, not a startup, not a side project, not something he talked about at dinner parties and never quite launched. A functioning, growing, profitable business. By the time Lily was born, he had about 14 full-time employees, a suite of offices in a good location off Route 23, and ongoing contracts with 3 regional hospital networks. He was good at what he did in the specific way that some people are just good at a thing, naturally organized, detail-oriented, capable of holding a lot of complexity in his head at once without losing the thread. I had scaled back my own career when Noah was born. Not stopped entirely, I kept a modest roster of freelance marketing clients, mostly remote work, mostly flexible hours, but I'd made the deliberate choice to be the parent who was home. We talked about it. We had the full conversation, the one about whose career was farther along and whose flexibility was greater and what the math looked like for childcare and what we both actually wanted. It made sense at the time. I don't regret making the choice. But I want you to understand clearly what that choice meant. I was at home. He was at the office. He ran the money, and I ran the house. That was the arrangement we had agreed upon. Hold on to that detail. It matters later. Because here is a thing that is true in far more marriages than people like to admit. When one partner handles the finances and the other handles the household partner is almost always operating with incomplete information. Not because anyone is hiding anything. Not yet, anyway. Just because the natural consequence of divided labor is divided knowledge. You know your domain and they know theirs, and most of the time that works fine, and you don't think about what you don't know until you have a reason to. Marcus was a good husband. I say that without reservation and without sarcasm. He was present. He was warm, in the particular way of a certain kind of emotionally even-keeled man, not effusive, not demonstrative, but consistent. Reliably there. He helped with homework. He coached Noah's soccer team one season, complained about it, and then did it again the next season because Noah asked him to. He took Lily to her dance recitals and sat in the folding chair in the gym and clapped at every single number, even the long group routines with the younger kids that went on for ages. He kissed me goodnight. Every night. For 11 years. I want you to have that image before I tell you the rest, because it matters. The texture of a life is not just the facts of it. The texture of my life with Marcus was warm and ordinary and real, and I do not believe, even now, that all of it was manufactured. I believe some of it was him, genuinely. And I believe that some people are capable of holding two entirely different versions of themselves inside the same body, and moving between them so smoothly that the people closest to them never see the seam. One Tuesday evening in March, Marcus sat down across from me at the kitchen table, folded his hands in front of him, and told me he wanted a divorce. He said he'd been unhappy for years. He said he felt like we'd grown apart, that we wanted different things now, that he needed to be honest with me. He said all the things that people say when this particular conversation happens, the phrases that come in a specific and recognizable order that you somehow know even when you've never heard them directed at you before. He said he thought we both deserved to be truly happy. And then he said he'd already spoken to an attorney. I remember exactly where I was sitting. I remember the mug of tea in front of me, still steaming. I remember the sound the refrigerator makes when it cycles on. I remember looking at his hands folded on the table and thinking, those are the same hands. He had already spoken to an attorney. I didn't know yet what that sentence meant. I was about to find out. But what I want you to hold on to, as I tell you everything that came after, is the image of that kitchen, that table, that mug of tea still steaming. Because everything I'm about to tell you happened against that backdrop, against 11 years of ordinary, real, warm life, and I think that context matters. I think it matters to understand that the thing I built was real before I tell you how it was being quietly dismantled. The first several weeks after Marcus told me he wanted a divorce, I moved through the world in a functional fog. Not the collapse kind. Not the dramatic television version of grief where someone can't get off the couch and stops eating and can't speak. The opposite, actually. I got up every morning at the same time. I made breakfast. I drove Noah and Lily to school. I answered emails. I went to the grocery store. I sat on the sideline at soccer on Thursday evenings and talked to other parents and smiled at the right moments, and no one who wasn't looking carefully would have known anything was wrong. Inside, I was working on understanding the shape of what was happening to me. A friend, someone who had been through her own divorce 3 years earlier, gave me the name of Karen Holloway. Family law attorney, mid-50s, 20 years in practice, office in a building downtown with a small brass plate on the door and a waiting room that smelled like old carpet and was somehow more comforting than it sounds. Karen is the kind of person who takes notes on a yellow legal pad and asks questions in a flat, neutral tone that doesn't let you read her reactions. She doesn't waste words. She doesn't perform empathy, she just gets to the problem. I sat across from her for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in late March, about 11 days after the kitchen table conversation, and I told her everything I knew about our finances. It took less time than I expected. That was the first uncomfortable realization. I knew about the 2 joint bank accounts, a checking account that Marcus funded monthly for household expenses, and a savings account I believed held somewhere between $35,000 and $45,000. I knew we had retirement accounts, though I couldn't have told you the exact balance without looking it up. I knew we had equity in the house, we'd bought it for $340 and had been there 8 years with a mortgage at a rate I couldn't precisely remember. I knew Marcus's business was profitable, though I knew that the way you know something when someone you trust has told you it's true, not from reading a document, not from looking at a number, but from a general, received sense. What I did not know, the details. The actual numbers. The structure. The accounts I hadn't been aware of. Whether what Marcus said about our finances matched what was actually true. Karen let me finish. Then she said, "How much involvement have you had in the business finances?" I said, "None, really. That was always his department." She made a note on the legal pad. She told me that divorce cases involving a spouse who owns a business are almost always more complex than they initially appear. She explained, in the measured, clinical way that Karen explains things, that business owners have financial tools available to them that salaried employees simply don't. The ability to adjust their own compensation up or down. The ability to defer income, to push profits into a different reporting period. The ability to classify personal expenses as business expenses, which both reduces apparent personal income and increases the appearance of business costs. The ability to create vendor relationships, employee arrangements, or corporate structures that don't appear on a simple personal financial statement. She said none of this meant Marcus had done any of these things. She said it was important that I understood the landscape. She said the courts expect financial disclosures to be complete and accurate, but the courts cannot verify disclosures that no one challenges, and the only person positioned to challenge them meaningfully was me, with the right professional support. She said the first thing she needed was a complete, verified picture of our finances, not Marcus's account of our finances, but an independently verified picture built from primary source documents, not summaries. She recommended a forensic accountant. She said his name was Gerald Sims. She said she worked with him regularly and that he was thorough. I went home that evening, put the kids to bed, sat in the kitchen after the house was quiet, and spent about an hour trying to honestly answer a question I hadn't previously had to ask myself. Did I believe Marcus was capable of hiding money? I turned it over carefully. I tried to be fair to the man I knew. I thought about his consistency, his presence, his reliability, his folded hands on the kitchen table. I thought about 11 years of dinners and school pickups and Saturday mornings. And I thought about this: he had spent years feeling unhappy, and I had not known. He had spoken to an attorney, who knew how far in advance of that Tuesday evening, and I had not known. He was capable, it turned out, of sustained concealment. Of containing something significant inside himself without it showing. That wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. And it was enough for me to decide that I needed to find out what I didn't know, rather than assuming it didn't exist. I called Karen the next morning and told her to hire Gerald Sims. Gerald Sims has been a certified public accountant for 26 years. He has been doing forensic accounting in the context of family law for the last 16 of those years. He is a trim, quiet man who looks to be in his late 50s, with reading glasses that he keeps on a cord around his neck and a manner of speaking that is measured to the point of being almost hypnotic. He does not speculate. He does not use words like probably or I think or it seems like. He speaks in terms of what the documents show, what the numbers indicate, what can and cannot be established from the available evidence. I found him reassuring in the way that a very good doctor can be reassuring, not because they're telling you good news, but because their competence is visible, and competence in someone whose job is to find the truth feels like a form of protection. He sat across from me in his office on a Wednesday afternoon in late April and explained exactly what the discovery process would involve. He had already, through Karen, received access to the initial financial disclosures Marcus's attorney had filed. He had looked at them. He did not say, in that first meeting, what he thought of them. He said he needed the primary source documents to do his work. He was going to request 5 years of records. All bank statements for the business accounts. All tax returns, personal and corporate. Payroll records. Vendor contracts. Expense reports. Any investment accounts. Any debt instruments. He was going to build a complete, documented picture of every dollar that had moved in and out of Marcus's professional and personal financial life for the past 5 years. He told me the process would take several months. He was honest about cost. His hourly rate was significant, and for a case involving a business of Marcus's size and complexity, I should expect to spend somewhere between $10,000 and $16,000 in forensic accounting fees alone. He told me there was no guarantee of finding anything that Marcus hadn't already disclosed. And then he said something I've thought about many times since. He said, in his experience, 16 years of it, when a business-owning spouse is the party who initiates divorce proceedings, and when that spouse has exercised sole control over both the business and the marital finances throughout the marriage, the forensic review almost always turns up significant discrepancies between what was disclosed and what actually exists. He wasn't suggesting anything specific about Marcus. He was describing a pattern. A reliable, recurring pattern. I thanked him and I went home and I called Karen and I told her to start the formal discovery process. The discovery process in an Ohio divorce is structured. Marcus's attorney was required to produce financial disclosures within a specific timeframe, and they did. The disclosures listed the joint accounts, the retirement accounts, the home equity, the business. For the business, Marcus's disclosure included a valuation prepared by someone his attorney had retained, arriving at a figure of approximately $800,000. The disclosure listed 2 investment accounts I hadn't previously known about, which Marcus's attorney characterized as modest and routine. It listed no other assets of significance. Gerald got his documents. And then Gerald got to work. Over the next 2 months, I received periodic updates, calls from Gerald, delivered with his characteristic precision, that told me he was finding things but wasn't yet ready to make definitive statements about what they meant. He would say, I found a series of transactions that I want to trace further. Or, there are vendor accounts in the business records that don't have a clear operational explanation. Or, I'm looking at a pattern in the expense classifications that I'd like to understand better. He never speculated. He never suggested a conclusion before he had the documentation to support it. I lived through those months in a specific kind of suspended state. I was present, I was at school pickups and soccer and birthday parties and all the things that kept going because children's lives don't pause for adult crises. But inside, I was waiting. Every time my phone rang and Gerald's number appeared on the screen, something in my chest went very still. Marcus had also moved out in June, just under 3 months after the kitchen table conversation. We'd agreed, awkwardly, through attorneys and through a few thin, careful conversations, that the arrangement wasn't sustainable. He found a rental apartment about 4 miles from the house. He kept his schedule with the kids. He texted me logistically, about pickup times and permission slips and whether Lily needed her sports bag on Tuesday or Thursday. We were civil. Precisely and deliberately civil, the way that people are civil when they are containing something large and choosing very carefully not to spill it. I was containing a question. I didn't know yet what the answer was. Gerald called me on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of July. I was in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store. 2 bags of produce on the back seat. The engine idling and the air conditioning on because it was 91 degrees outside and the parking lot was a heat sink. I'd pulled in 10 minutes earlier and was finishing a podcast before going inside. His name came up on the screen and I turned off the podcast and the engine and I answered. He said, Diane, I have my findings ready and I'd like to walk you through them. Are you somewhere you can talk? I said yes. I turned off the engine. The car started warming up immediately. He started with the business valuation. Marcus had declared the business worth $800,000. That figure had been produced by a valuation professional retained by Marcus's own attorney. Gerald had conducted an independent valuation using standard methods for service-based consulting businesses, comparable company analyses, revenue multiples, assessment of contracts, client retention rates, business infrastructure, and projected revenue streams based on historical performance. His figure was approximately $1.4 million. Marcus had understated the value of the business by $600,000. I held that for a moment. $600,000. Not in a hidden account, not moved anywhere, just described, in an official legal document, at a figure that was $600,000 below what it was actually worth. And then Gerald said, but that's not the primary finding. There was the pause he does when he is choosing words carefully, making sure what he says is exactly accurate and not 1 degree past what the evidence supports. He said, over the past 4 years, I've identified a pattern of transactions that I believe represents the systematic diversion of marital assets into accounts that were not disclosed in Marcus's financial statements. The total I can document is $340,000. I want to tell you what happened in my body when he said that, because I think it's important. Nothing happened. That's the honest answer. I didn't gasp. I didn't feel a rush of anger or vindication. I just held very still, the way you hold still when a doctor is about to tell you something significant and your body goes into a kind of waiting mode before the information fully lands. Gerald kept talking. He explained the mechanics of what he'd found. There were vendor payments in the business records, payments to companies that should, if they were legitimate service providers, have left behind contracts, invoices, deliverables, some form of documentation that money had exchanged hands for actual goods or services rendered. Several of these vendors had none of that. Gerald had traced them through business registration records in 3 states and found that several were either dissolved entities with no recent operating history or, in one case, a company with Marcus listed as a registered agent under a slightly different variation of his name. There were personal expenses, significant ones, travel and equipment and meals and what were classified as client entertainment costs, that had been run through the business accounts and deducted as business expenses. The effect of this was twofold: it reduced the apparent profitability of the business, which lowered the valuation, and it reduced Marcus's declared personal income, which affected the calculations for support and asset division. And there was a third category of transactions that Gerald described as income rerouting, situations where client payments that should, based on the contract terms Gerald had been able to obtain, have come into the main business account were instead directed into a secondary account that had not appeared in Marcus's financial disclosures. He said, I want to be clear that what I've described is documented. I'm not speculating. The discrepancies I'm pointing to are in the records. The question of exactly where the full amount went, the mechanics of how it was stored or deployed, is something I've been able to trace in part, but not completely. I asked him, when did these transactions begin? He said, the pattern I can identify most clearly begins approximately 4 years ago and becomes more systematic about 3 years ago. 4 years ago. I sat in the hot car and I did the math. 4 years ago Noah was 7, Lily was 5. We went to the Outer Banks that summer. I have photographs on my phone from that trip, the kids with sand buckets, Marcus in sunglasses squinting into the light, all of us at a restaurant where we got the wrong order and ended up laughing about it. I have that photograph. 4 years ago Marcus was building shell companies and running personal expenses through business accounts and diverting money away from our marital estate. I called Karen from the driveway when I got home. She said, get me Gerald's written report as soon as it's finalized. She said it in the flat, focused way that Karen speaks when she's already 3 steps ahead. I said okay. I sat in the driveway for another 10 minutes before I went inside. Now I need to tell you about Richard. Richard is Marcus's accountant. Has been for 8 years, as far as I understand it. He handled both the business taxes and Marcus's personal returns throughout the period covered by Gerald's investigation. He is, by all accounts, a careful and conscientious professional, the kind of person who has built a practice on accuracy and discretion and the reliable execution of a technically demanding job. For 8 years, I was barely aware Richard existed. He was a name Marcus mentioned in passing around tax season. Someone in the background of our financial life, invisible to me in the way that specialists are invisible when everything appears to be running smoothly. Gerald, in the course of his investigation, had issued subpoenas for financial documents to a range of entities, Marcus's business, various banks, and third-party professionals including the accountant who prepared the tax returns. Richard received a subpoena. It listed specific documents, returns, supporting schedules, certain correspondence. He was legally required to comply. He complied. And then he did something he was not legally required to do. He called Gerald's office. Gerald told me about this call on a follow-up conversation we had about 10 days after the initial call in the parking lot. He said, Marcus's accountant reached out to us voluntarily. He said he wanted to make sure we had the complete picture. I asked Gerald to tell me what that meant. Gerald said he provided everything we subpoenaed, and then he flagged additional items that he felt we should be aware of and provided supporting documentation for those as well. Here's what Richard had flagged. Richard had been preparing Marcus's taxes for 8 years. He knew the business thoroughly. He knew its revenue trends, its typical expense structure, its payroll patterns, its client base, its seasonal variation. He had a professional-level understanding of what this business looked like when it was operating normally. Beginning roughly 2 years ago, Gerald's read of the timing, based on the documentation Richard provided, Richard had started noticing transactions that didn't match the pattern he knew. Vendor payments to companies he couldn't find any prior record of. Expense classifications that didn't align with the business's operational history. Shifts in how certain income was being reported that, individually, might have innocent explanations, but taken together created a picture that didn't add up. Richard had raised these things with Marcus. Not in an accusatory way, professionally, the way a good accountant raises a question. I want to make sure I'm classifying this correctly. Can you walk me through this vendor relationship? Can you explain the purpose of this expense? Marcus had provided explanations. Richard had, at the time, accepted them. He was Marcus's accountant. He had an 8-year professional relationship with the man. He had no definitive proof of anything. But he had kept notes. Detailed, dated, professional notes documenting each of those conversations. What question he'd asked. What explanation Marcus had provided. Whether the documentation Marcus had supplied in support of that explanation was complete or partial. Whether anything about the answer had left Richard with unresolved questions. The notes weren't accusations. They weren't a fraud finding or an allegation. They were just the record of a careful professional paying attention to things that didn't fully satisfy him, and writing it down. When the subpoena came, Richard complied with its terms. And then he called Gerald and said, I want to make sure you have the full picture. And he provided those notes. Gerald said, his notes corroborate my independent findings in several key areas. The transactions he flagged are the same transactions I'd identified as anomalous. His documentation of Marcus's explanations for those transactions is relevant because it establishes that Marcus was aware of them and had provided a specific account of their purpose. Do you understand what that means? It means that Richard's notes were not just corroboration of the financial discrepancies. They were documentation that Marcus had specifically addressed those transactions and characterized them in a particular way, a characterization that Gerald's independent analysis showed to be false. That's not just missing money. That's a documented, traceable lie. I asked Gerald why he thought Richard had done it, gone beyond what was required. Gerald was quiet for a moment in the way Gerald is quiet when he is being precise. He said, he's a CPA. He has professional and legal obligations that exist independently of his client relationships. And I think he had been uncomfortable for a long time and wasn't sure what to do with that discomfort until he had a legitimate, legal channel through which to act on it. I've thought about Richard many times since then. More than I expected to. I've tried to imagine that call he made to Gerald's office, what he said, how he said it, whether it felt significant to him in the moment or whether it felt like a routine professional courtesy that he couldn't have known would matter as much as it did. I've wondered what it cost him. Marcus was a client. Not his only client, presumably, but 8 years is a significant professional relationship. I have no idea what happened to that relationship after the divorce proceedings made Gerald's report public. I imagine it didn't survive. I've wondered if Richard knew how much his call mattered. If he sat at his desk afterward with any sense of what he'd just set in motion. With Gerald's findings and Richard's corroborating notes, the documentation was, in Karen's word when she read the complete report, airtight. The vendor companies were traced. The shell company with Marcus's name as registered agent was documented. The expense misclassifications were enumerated and totaled. The income rerouting was mapped. Richard's notes established Marcus's awareness and his specific false characterizations of what was happening. $340,000. 4 years. And a man named Richard who made a phone call he didn't have to make. Karen filed an amended response to Marcus's divorce petition in early September. She attached Gerald's complete forensic accounting report as an exhibit. She attached the relevant corroborating documentation. She filed a motion alleging fraud on the court, citing Marcus's financial disclosures as materially false, specifically enumerating the understated business valuation, the undisclosed vendor transactions, the misclassified expenses, and the unaccounted-for income rerouting. I wasn't in the room when Marcus's attorney received those documents. I'll never know exactly what happened on his end when he read them, what he said to Marcus, what Marcus said to him, what the conversation looked like when a man who has spent 4 years building a financial structure designed to be invisible is confronted with a 40-page forensic accounting report that makes it entirely visible. What I know is that Marcus's attorney called Karen within 48 hours. I was in the kitchen when Karen called to tell me. I was cutting apples for Noah's after-school snack. I remember the sound the knife made on the cutting board. I remember setting it down when I saw Karen's number. She said, "They want to talk." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "They've seen the report. They're not planning to contest the findings." That sentence, "they're not planning to contest the findings," is one of the most important sentences anyone has ever said to me. It meant they had looked at the documentation and determined that fighting it wasn't viable. It meant everything Gerald had built, everything Richard had corroborated, was solid enough that the other side had decided the better move was to negotiate rather than litigate. The negotiation lasted 2 months. I want to be honest about what that means, because I think people sometimes imagine that once the evidence is clear, the process becomes fast and clean. It doesn't. It becomes clearer, but it doesn't become fast. There are still proposals and counterproposals. There are still long calls with Karen where she walks me through numbers and I ask questions and take notes and sit with the discomfort of making large financial decisions under emotional duress. Marcus's attorney's position, initially, was that some of what Gerald had identified was attributable to accounting errors or poor record-keeping rather than intentional concealment. Karen's position was that the pattern of transactions, the documentation trail, the shell company with Marcus's name, and Richard's contemporaneous notes establishing Marcus's awareness all made the question of intentionality quite clear, and that the court would likely agree. That argument was eventually abandoned. The negotiation also had to address the business valuation. The difference between $800,000 and $1.4 million is $600,000. And $600,000 divided between 2 parties in a divorce is $300,000 apiece. That figure alone was transformative. I am not going to share the exact settlement numbers, for a few reasons. The first is that some of the terms are confidential. The second is that I have children, and the details of their parents' financial settlement aren't something I need to broadcast. The third is that the specific numbers are less important than the shape of what happened. The shape of what happened is this: Marcus's original proposal had valued the marital estate at approximately $1.2 million. After Gerald's corrected business valuation and the accounting for the hidden and diverted assets, the actual marital estate was closer to $2.2 million. The difference between those two numbers, split between 2 people, is $500,000 per person. Which means the difference between the settlement I would have accepted before Gerald's investigation and the settlement I received after it is, for me personally, $500,000. $500,000. That is the number that sits at the bottom of all of this. That is the number that explains why I spent the money on a forensic accountant when I was already hemorrhaging money on legal fees. That is the number that explains why I hired Karen Holloway instead of a cheaper general practice attorney. That is the number that answers the question of whether it was worth it. It was worth it by a factor of 30. In addition to the corrected asset division, the settlement included a retroactive adjustment to the child support calculation based on Marcus's actual documented income rather than the income he had declared in his initial disclosures. It included Marcus's agreement to cover a significant portion of the forensic accounting fees. It included terms I'd asked Karen to fight for specifically related to the children, educational provisions, healthcare provisions, a structure designed to insulate them from the financial effects of what their father had done. The divorce was finalized in November. I signed the settlement agreement at Karen's office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, 6 times on different pages. Karen shook my hand. She said, "You handled this extremely well." I drove home. I picked up the kids from my neighbor who had been watching them. I made dinner, helped with homework, gave baths, read to Lily because she still likes to be read to, and I will read to her for as long as she lets me. After they were both asleep, I sat in the kitchen in the quiet and I let the full weight of it come down. Not grief, exactly. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than either. The feeling of having survived something that required resources you weren't sure you had, and finding out, at the end, that you did. I've had months now since the settlement was finalized. Enough time to stop moving at the pace of crisis and start moving at the pace of regular life, which is its own adjustment. Here's what I know now that I didn't know before. The first thing is about money and what it means. $340,000 is an enormous amount of money in any context. It is particularly enormous in the context of what it was used for, not spent, not invested in anything real, but hidden. Extracted from a shared financial life and routed away from its rightful distribution. The effort that went into that extraction was not trivial. The vendor registrations, the misclassified expenses, the secondary accounts, the years of careful accounting manipulation, that takes sustained, deliberate effort. You don't do that accidentally. You don't do it without thinking about what you're doing. And what that means is that for 4 years, while I was at school pickups and soccer and bedtime stories and Saturday mornings in the kitchen, Marcus was also, in parallel, building a financial escape route. Not just from the marriage, but from an honest accounting of what we had built. He was planning for a version of the divorce in which I would not know what he had taken. I don't say this to villainize him. I say it because I think it's important to be clear-eyed about what happened. Some people hear a story like this and they frame it as one bad decision, a moment of panic, a mistake made under pressure. This was not one decision. This was hundreds of decisions over 4 years. It was methodical and sustained and premeditated in the most literal sense of that word, thought about before it was done, repeatedly, for years. I have had to make peace with knowing that about the man I was married to. It has taken time. I am not finished. The second thing I want to tell you is about professional help, and why you should not talk yourself out of it. I have talked to a number of women in the past year, through a divorce support group I joined, through conversations that happen when people find out you've been through something like this, and I have heard, more times than I can count, a version of the following. My husband would never do that. I can't afford a forensic accountant, the legal fees are already so high. I don't want to be adversarial. I feel like asking for full financial disclosure is somehow accusing him of something. I understand every single one of those feelings. I had them. I sat in my car in the parking lot and felt them and had to consciously decide to put them aside and do the thing that needed to be done. Here's what I want you to hear. The forensic accounting fees I paid were returned to me many times over in the corrected settlement. They were not an additional expense on top of an already expensive process. They were the most effective financial investment I made during the entire divorce. The return on that investment was measurable, documented, and transformative. If your spouse owns a business, or has any degree of financial control that you don't have full visibility into, please hire a forensic accountant. Not because your spouse is definitely hiding something. Possibly they're not. Possibly everything they've disclosed is accurate and the forensic accountant comes back with a clean report and all you've done is paid for certainty. That certainty, in itself, has value. But if they're not clean, if there's something there, not knowing is infinitely more expensive than finding out. The third thing is about information asymmetry, and what it costs you when the ground shifts. For 11 years, I operated with a general, impressionistic understanding of my own financial life. I knew the broad shape. I didn't know the details. I didn't ask to see the tax returns. I wasn't on the business accounts. I didn't attend meetings with the accountant or the financial planner. I trusted Marcus to handle the finances, and I handled everything else, and that felt like a reasonable division of labor, and it was fine right up until it wasn't. And when it wasn't fine anymore, I found myself in the position of trying to understand my own financial life through the work of professionals I had to hire and pay to reconstruct information I should have had access to the whole time. I am not blaming myself for the things Marcus did. That is a different and separate matter. But I am saying, if you are in a marriage where one person handles all the finances, that is worth examining. Not because you suspect your partner of anything, but because you deserve to understand your own life. Because your name is on that marriage and whatever is accumulated in it is partly yours, and you have a right and a responsibility to know what that is. Know where the accounts are. Read the tax returns. Understand the rough shape of a business if your spouse owns one. Have a conversation, not a confrontation, a conversation, about what your financial picture actually looks like. If your spouse resists that conversation, that is itself significant information. The fourth thing is about Richard. I've thought about Richard so many times. The accountant who made the call he didn't have to make. Who looked at a subpoena that specified certain documents and provided those documents and then, separately, made sure Gerald had everything else too. I've thought about what that must have felt like. He was Marcus's accountant. He had prepared his taxes for 8 years, had presumably met with him annually, had the kind of quiet professional relationship that accumulates a certain weight of familiarity over time. And somewhere along the way he had seen things that made him uncomfortable and had written them down and had sat with the discomfort and had not been sure what to do with it. And then the subpoena arrived, and it gave him a channel. A legal, structured, unambiguous channel. He wasn't making an allegation. He wasn't going outside any proper procedure. He was complying with a legal requirement and then making sure the person on the other end had the complete picture. I want to say something to anyone who might be in Richard's position, anyone who has seen something in a professional context that doesn't add up, that hasn't sat right, that they've been carrying quietly without knowing what to do with it. The channel matters. When the channel exists, use it. Make the call. Provide the documentation. Make sure the right people have the full picture. The consequences of that choice can be enormous in ways you will never be able to fully see. I don't know what happened to Richard's relationship with Marcus after the divorce. I can imagine it didn't survive. I don't know if Marcus knows it was Richard's call to Gerald that turned the corroboration from possible to undeniable. I don't know if Richard thinks about it. But I think about it. I think about it and I feel something that is harder to name than simple gratitude. Something more like the recognition that sometimes the thing that changes everything is a quiet act by someone who had no particular reason to do it except that their conscience wouldn't leave them alone. The fifth thing is about my children. Noah and Lily are okay. They are genuinely, truly, adaptably okay in the way that children are when the adults in their lives manage to contain their chaos sufficiently that the children can keep being children. We have a schedule that works. They move between 2 houses with more ease than I expected. They have good relationships with both of us. They are funny and loud and exhausting and exactly themselves. But I think about what the different settlement would have meant for them. The original proposal. The one based on the understated valuation and the hidden assets and the suppressed income. What that would have meant for the house, for their schools, for the financial foundation of their childhoods, for the kind of security that doesn't show up anywhere visible but that underlies everything. We came close to that different outcome. We came very close. If I hadn't hired Karen. If Karen hadn't recommended Gerald. If Gerald hadn't been thorough enough to find what he found. If Richard hadn't made his call. Any one of those things not happening and I am in a materially different position. My children are in a materially different position. That's the thought that I can't fully put down. How close the near miss was. The sixth thing is about starting over, and what that actually looks like. I am 43 years old. I am starting over. And I want to tell you that it is simultaneously harder than I expected and less terrifying than I expected, and both of those things are true at the same time without contradicting each other. It is harder because I built my adult life inside a partnership that no longer exists, and rebuilding alone means learning to make decisions in a silence that used to be shared. It means the late nights when the house is quiet and the weight of sole responsibility is just very, very heavy. It means watching your children move between their two lives and not being able to fully protect them from the knowledge that the original life is gone. It means grief, not constant, not debilitating, but present, surfacing at inconvenient moments in inconvenient forms. It is less terrifying because I know now what I am capable of, and that knowledge is not something Marcus can take back, and not something that goes away when the process is over. It stays. It accumulates. I handled something genuinely difficult, at the worst possible moment, with inadequate information, under significant emotional duress, and I handled it well. I asked the right questions. I made the right decisions. I didn't let fear or sentimentality or the understandable desire to avoid conflict talk me into accepting a version of things that wasn't true. I know my financial situation now. Not approximately, I know it in detail. I have a financial advisor I meet with quarterly. I have a budget that I understand and manage myself. I have a retirement account in my name alone that I check and rebalance and care for the way you care for a thing that you have decided belongs to you. I understand my money in a way I never did when Marcus was the person who understood it. That part, that particular shift, is something I will not give back. This story is mine. It is specific to me, to Marcus, to our kitchen in Columbus, to Richard's phone call, to Karen's yellow legal pad, to Gerald's measured precision, to two children named Noah and Lily who are doing their homework on Tuesday afternoons in a family that looks different than it used to. But there are pieces of it that I don't think are just mine. There are a lot of Marcuses in the world. Not all of them hide money, that would be the wrong lesson to take. But there are a lot of people who are capable of sustained concealment of something significant while maintaining the appearance of a completely normal life. And the lesson of that is not to live in suspicion of everyone you love. The lesson is that trust is not the same as knowledge. That presence is not the same as transparency. That the warmth and reliability of a good marriage does not immunize you against the possibility that you do not fully know your own financial life. There are also a lot of people who are in the fog right now. In the first weeks or months of something falling apart, trying to understand the shape of what's happening, trying to figure out what they should be doing and whether they're doing the right thing and whether things will get better. If that is you, get a lawyer who specializes in family law. Not a general practice attorney who also does estate planning and real estate. Someone who lives in family law, who knows the local courts, who has seen the specific tactics that this specific situation calls for. A good referral from someone who has been through a divorce is worth more than any amount of online searching. If your spouse owns a business, or is self-employed, or has had significantly more financial control than you during the marriage, hire a forensic accountant. Do not let the cost talk you out of it. Do the math. What percentage of what you might be missing is the forensic accounting fee? Almost certainly, a very small percentage. Request full financial disclosure and don't negotiate around it. Everything, in writing, with supporting documentation. Independent verification. Don't accept a number without knowing how it was calculated. And be honest with yourself about what you know and what you don't know. Not to blame yourself for the gap, you didn't cause the gap, and the gap is not a character flaw. But because the only way to close it is to acknowledge it, and the only way to protect yourself is to close it. Know your financial life. Your name is on it. And your name being on it means you have both the right and the responsibility to understand it, not in a paranoid way, not in an adversarial way, but in the basic, fundamental way that a person understands the ground they're standing on. Because if the ground moves, you want to know what was under it. I want to say one more thing, and it's about the particular shape that recovery takes. It's not linear. It doesn't progress steadily from worse to better in a smooth, trackable trajectory. It moves in directions that don't always make sense. There are weeks that are fine and then a Tuesday evening in February when something small happens, the kids mention something Marcus said, or you drive past a restaurant where you used to go, or the light in the kitchen comes in sideways at that particular October angle, and the weight of it lands on you again, fully and without warning. And then it passes. And you make dinner. And you help with homework. And you put the kids to bed and sit in the kitchen, and the quiet is yours, specifically and entirely yours, and that is something. It is different from what I had. I am not going to pretend that different means better in some easy, affirming, television movie way. It is different. Some things about it are worse and some things about it are better, and most things about it are simply new, and newness takes time to become familiar. What I can tell you is that I'm okay. And that okay, after what happened, after what I found out, after the months of legal proceedings and financial discovery and the reconfiguring of an entire life, okay is more than I expected to be, on the day I sat in the kitchen and Marcus folded his hands on the table. If you've been through something like this, or you're going through something like it right now, the comments are open. Not for advice, I'm not qualified to give advice, but to know that someone else has sat in the same parking lot heat and received the same kind of phone call and come out the other side still standing. If this story reached someone who needed to hear it, share it with someone who might need to hear it too. I'll see you in the next one. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories here, and more people who need to hear them. Stay close.